Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible Radio right here on Blog Talk Radio. I'm here with Don Preston, our co-host, and we are excited to bring you another message where we talk about matters that pertain to the end time as we do some very serious and careful exegesis of Scripture, comparing the things of God with the things of men. And it's always good to be able to sit down and have a good Bible study. Hope that you are comfortable. Maybe you have something refreshing to drink, got your feet propped up on the ottoman or something, and lying back, reclining back in your comfortable recliner, and you're just ready to listen. We do not want you to go to sleep, however. So don't get too comfortable, but we're delighted that you're here. Don, how are you today?
Well, I'm doing absolutely great, William. It's been an exciting day. Some days kind of rock along, this, that, and the other kind of going on, and other days get fast, furious, and hectic, as the saying goes. And this has been one of those fast, furious, and hectic days. Some of the events I can't really talk about just yet, but I will say that on Facebook, just this morning, when I logged on, I received one of those notifications of a discussion that had been going on one of those Facebook pages. And as you know, William, I had issued an open challenge some good long while back and had repeatedly posted the challenge to meet an amillennialist in formal public debate here at Preterist Pilgrim Weekend in July. Well, no amillennialist had stepped forward at that up to this morning. But on this particular Facebook page, a gentleman by the name of Jaime Pickett said, if you're looking for someone to have a formal debate, I am a seasoned dispensationalist, and you may consider this my formal challenge to you to meet in formal debate. Well, since our Preterist Pilgrim Weekend this year is on amillennialism, it's not on dispensationalism, it's not really what I was looking for in July. But I was certainly intrigued by the challenge. Mr. Pickett is a well-qualified academic, if you please. He is currently finishing a work on his PhD in theology and has been a pastor and a minister and this and that and the other. Certainly seems qualified. And so he and I began to negotiate. And I'm waiting now for a confirmation email. But I asked Dr. Pickett where he proposed if he had an idea for a venue for a debate. And as it turns out, he is a part of Thomas Ice's pre-tribulation wrath organization. And he has actually offered that I would travel to Washington, D.C. to have this debate during one of their prophecy conferences in Washington, D.C. Well, needless to say, I was thrilled with such an opportunity and invitation. So I'm simply waiting from him to receive confirmation for dates to see if it conflicts with my schedule. so that we can get this thing nailed down and work on having a debate at one of the big Bible prophecy conferences sponsored by Thomas Ice and his organization, his and Tim LaHaye's organization, which is the Pre-Trib Research Institute. And so we will see if Dr. Pickett will carry through, if he will live up to his challenge, and we'll see if this debate actually takes place. But it's quite an exciting thing, and other things have happened today that, again, I cannot divulge at this particular time, but we have tentative agreement on another situation. So it's been rather an exciting day.
Well, that is very, very good. It is exciting always to hear that we have these things, these kind of opportunities opening up, and the audience is getting larger and larger. And I think it's time, it's appropriate. It's time for preterism to really break out on the world scene, and we're working at it on both ends. We're still engaged in some possible talks for discussions ourselves, and so this could be very good. The aim is to try to get as wide a platform as we possibly can. There's so many things going on that I feel really need to have this paradigm and this perspective presented, because people need to see what the alternatives are to everything that's going on out there. So I hope that discussion comes off. I think it will be a great benefit to everyone, and it certainly will do quite a bit to help stem the tide of some of the teachings that we have going on out there that are just, in my judgment, and I'm sure you would agree, are just not in the line with what the Bible teaches, or not in line with what the Bible teaches. So we're looking forward to that.
Well, I think everyone needs to know of how active that you are currently being in the black community and reaching out to several different camps in the black community. Pardon me. And some of the work that you're doing there, some of the impact that you're having. And by the way, William, I'm still waiting on the links that you promised to send me in regard to Mr. Rosenberg, so that we can take a look at that, which is another possible debate. And as you've already mentioned, you are certainly working on the possibility of a debate in regard to some of the folks, some of the camps in the black community that you're dealing with. And so, boy, yeah, you talk about some exciting things going on. Pardon me, a lot of this of necessity takes place on private communication level until everything is locked down and firmed up and what have you. But it's so exciting to know that people are increasingly willing to at least discuss this issue. And then, of course, unfortunately, you still have that segment of some denominations in which all that they want to do is throw rocks, that all they want to do is call names, all they want to do is cast aspersions, question a person's integrity. If you disagree with them, you're automatically a liar, you're automatically a false teacher, you're automatically doomed to hell if you in any way disagree with them. And it's so refreshing to correspond with people. And in the correspondence that I've had today, I have impressed upon the individuals that I've corresponded with that I have an absolute dedication to proper Christian decorum and Christian conduct in Christian debate. And these individuals have both agreed with that, saying they agree 100% on the absolute need for Christian decorum in public controversy. So, pardon me, again, it's so refreshing that you can encounter people of very high academic achievement who are willing to discuss the issues and who have a mutual agreement that if there are going to be discussions, it's going to be done in a Christian manner. So we're very, very excited about the opportunities that are opening up, very, very excited about the potential for good that is there, because, William, as you and I both know, Every time that covenant eschatology has received public exposure in debates like this, the results have been positive for covenant eschatology. So we very much look forward to these opportunities.
Yes, let me say something about some of the opportunities that I've been working on. You know, a lot of this started when I had this debate with Carl Albert. You know, I was just being introduced to what is called the Hebrew Israelite community, and what I didn't know at the time was that there were many different segments or sects, groups, etc., that are not necessarily the same, even though they have some similar views. And some of them are messianic, some of them are non-messianic. So, they take this view of the Torah and are very strong in the Torah. Some of them are, just as much against Christ as you would have, other Jewish sects that you and I have encountered before. But at the same time, there are others who are very pro messianic. And what's happening is I have been, putting these videos out and just kind of hanging out in these communities, and just took basically a inquiry approach initially, and I was immediately pounced upon, and then we got into some conversations back and forth, through YouTube videos, etc. And then over time, as I learned more, been hanging out, trying to, watch their videos, etc., learning what the talking points are, then I began making videos and addressing some of those things. And now, Don, there are actually people in that community. Some of them are basically watching the videos and saying, amen, this is right, this is true. More people need to watch these videos. I mean, really. I've had a discussion with the guy where we exchange, I know, at least 50 comments back and forth just on one particular video. And so we're beginning to make some inroads. They're small. But here's the other thing, in terms of a platform. There's another platform out there that's coming out of Harlem, New York. It's called Cited TV. Now, it's definitely, the pro-black television, and it's not necessarily Bible-based. As a matter of fact, they hate the Bible. The guy who runs the show, they do everything they can to ridicule and minimize the Bible. However, they do have the Hebrew Israelites on there occasionally, and they do know of me, now. And they know we've been trying to sort of break in, but they're very resistant at this point to allowing us to have a platform. But here's the power of that platform. It's being viewed all over the world. As a matter of fact, the guy from Israel came over because, they're getting the attention of people in Israel, and there was a debate between this guy in Israel. You mentioned his name, Harry Rosenberg, and we're hopeful that we can get a discussion with him and you on a platform, sometime in the future. But at the same time, you got people in universities who are listening, people all over the continent of Africa who are listening, and all around the world that's listening to that platform. And it's basically opening up some channels, and even if it doesn't open up that one because there are some people they don't allow on it, there are other avenues that are coming about as a result of that. So there's another channel kind of like it in the UK. I've already contacted that guy. He's on Facebook, but see, they don't contact me back at this point. But what has been happening, I appeared on this Debate Talk for You radio program a while back. I think this was back in sometime around I'd say right after I came. I think it was June or something. I can't remember. But anyway, it was right before I had the debate with Carl Albert, and I was supposed to have another debate. I found out, this is funny, and ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us, but I mean, this is exciting stuff. I was supposed to have a debate with another gentleman on right after Carl Albert. He was a guy that was pretty high up and well respected, but I've been told that these guys have been kind of, and the terminology they're using is that they're sneaking around on preterist sites, getting their information and going back and presenting it like they've been doing it all the time, and they're actually teaching what we're teaching. So, and those are some of the reasons why we're not having these debates, because these guys are learning, they are studying, they are articulate and knowledgeable in Scripture. It's just, here's some things that they hadn't considered, and they're beginning to learn them, and it's beginning to spread. So we are really, really excited about that. And by the way, I had Larry on the radio show this morning along with another guy, but that's what's happening. People are doing it. There are other guys starting communication and broadcasts, etc., to get the word of preterism out. They've been listening to you for a while. They've been listening to me for a while, and now they're beginning to do things on their own. So it's happening.
Yeah, it truly is. We've said it before many, many times, but it truly is an exciting time to be living, to see doors opening up. And, you know, on the reverse side of that, I'm not going to say very much about this at all because I don't want to, don't feel much need to. There are always stragglers, and that's not even the good term for it, but there are always those who are on the fringes, who want to represent or preterism, or who want to detract from the core message and the truth of covenant eschatology. Mm-hmm. And it's really sad to see a lot of that going on Facebook with personalities playing such a dominant role. It's not even exegesis. You know, some are just outright skeptics claiming to be preterist. Some are practical atheists claiming to be preterist, et cetera, et cetera. Some are nothing more than faith-destroying, godless people, all claiming to be preterists. And it's really imperative that people take a serious look at the soundness, the solid nature of the material that folks like William and I present, and not get caught up in some of what I call nonsense, of so much speculation, of so much argumentation that's based on presuppositions, based on tradition, and it's not based on solid exegesis. And it's just like any other movement in the entire history of Christianity. We are at a stage in the movement in which there's some pretty wild and pretty weird stuff and individuals out there. I mean, that needs to be said. It's sad, but guess what, folks? That's been true of every movement in the history of Christianity. It was true of the Reformation movement surrounding John Calvin even, and certainly Martin Luther. And for us to expect total sanity, to use the term, for us to expect that every single person who comes into the movement is good, solid, sound, and sane is really honestly asking too much. The Bible said, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it is necessary for there to be heresies so that the truth might be manifested. Now, the word heresies meant it's necessary for the divergent, for different things to be present. Not necessarily damnable things to be present, but it's necessary that there be divergent views so that the truth itself would be manifested. And so while it's troublesome, while it's bothersome, and while at times it's even disturbing, when we hear some of these weird, wild, and crazy things that are said in the name of covenant eschatology and preterism, once again, we cannot expect anything else because people are involved. And where there are human beings involved, guess what, folks? You're going to have some pretty weird stuff come up from time to time. So all of that said, it truly is an exciting time. It truly is absolutely fantastic to see movement across the entire denominational spectrum of people who are interested, who are inquiring, who are serious. And this is happening among people who are very well qualified academically, who are expressing a genuine interest, men who can, shall we say, take the next step and help the movement take the next step. So, yeah, it's great. It's a great time to be alive, great time to be a participant in what we are trying to do.
Okay, let me just announce I was a little bit late, ladies and gentlemen, getting a chat room open. So if you are listening and you want to come into the chat room and post your questions there, you may do so. If you have a question you want to get on the air, then you can call 347-838-8828. 8252. That's 347-838-8252. We'll take your call, get your question, and then put it on the air. Dunn, we did have a question left over from the previous week. I don't know if you still have that handy.
No, I do not. I was
all right.
I was sitting here thinking that I had completely forgotten that question.
Okay, but we did have someone ask it, and we want to honor them with the response to it. I will look it up while you just go ahead and get started on what we're going to talk about tonight, and
yes.
I'll have it for you shortly.
Very, very good. Well, folks, we want to continue, and actually we're going to conclude this evening with our examination of the presentation that was given by Mr. Gary Summers at the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship in June of 2015. And his presentation was on the second, quote, coming, unquote, of Jesus Christ. And Gary Summers made the observation that there are several different kinds of comings in the Bible. And he delineated those or explored those by saying there are national judgments, and those national judgments in which God used one nation to judge another nation. He said those are spoken of throughout the Old Testament. Now, what I found interesting, folks, all right, what I found interesting is that Gary Summers said that one of the predictions of a time of national judgment that actually referred to AD 70 was found in Joel 2:28-32, in which God predicted that he would pour out his Spirit upon all flesh before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, why do I find that so fascinating? Well, I find it so fascinating because some of the other men on the lectureship, on the Bellview lectureship, were emphatic and adamant in their claims that the great and terrible day of the Lord of Joel 2 is, in fact, the end of time. Now, remember, folks, we're dealing with men on that lectureship who, by and large, take the position that if you differ with them, if you disagree with their eschatological position, then guess what? You're a false teacher. So we had men on the lectureship that were affirming that the great and terrible day of the Lord of Joel chapter 2, cited by Peter in Acts chapter 2, was the end of time. That's supposed to be the biblical truth of it. Then Gary Summers stands up and says, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The great and terrible day of the Lord of Joel 2, and therefore Acts chapter 2, was the coming of the Lord in AD 70, a time of national judgment. So we have two conflicting, contrary, eschatological views at work on the Bellview Church of Christ lecture, each position saying they are teaching the truth, and that anything other than what they are teaching is not the truth. In fact, it is false doctrine. So it was fascinating to hear Gary Summers speak about the different kinds of coming and to list some passages that he applied to AD 70 in national judgment when some of the other men do, in fact, disagree with him. And by the way, folks, I want to go back to something that we touched upon briefly last week, and that was the discussion of Gary Summers' discussion of the age to come. Gary Summers was literally all over the map when it came to his discussion of the term, this age and the age to come. He said sometimes the term, this age, when used by Jesus and the New Testament writers, referred to the Mosaic age, and the age to come was the Christian age. Then, however, he turned right around and said, sometimes the term, this age, refers to the Christian age, and the age to come refers to that state of being after the end of time, which is not truly an age, as we pointed out last week. Now, one of the passages, and I'll simply mention this by way of concluding the discussion that we had on this age and the age to come from last week, is Gary Summers took the position that in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 5, when the writer says, he, that is God, has not put the age to come of which we speak in subjection to the angels. But of the Son he said, sit at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. Now, here's what's fascinating about this, folks. In Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5, the writer is undeniably referencing the age to come. The Greek of the text, it is literally the age about to come. The Greek word melo with the infinitive is used in that text. So it is literally, he has not put the age about to come in subjection to the angels. Well, no, wait a minute. Here is Gary Summers saying that age that the writer of Hebrews said was about to come was the Christian age that had already come. Wait a minute. So we have the writer of Hebrews talking about something, and by the way, in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 5, the writer speaks of those who have tasted of the power of the age about to come. Folks, look, about to come doesn't mean has already come. It means about to come. And yet here is Gary Summers saying, no, the age to come is not correct because we're already in that age. That age began at either at the cross or Pentecost, depending upon which position he might take. So whereas Jesus spoke of the age to come being the Christian age, and even though Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5 and Hebrews chapter 6 speaks of the age to come, Gary Summers says, well, you know, when Jesus was here on earth and spoke of the age to come, he was referring to the Christian age. But when Hebrews 2 speaks of the age that was about to come, he was speaking of the age that he was already in. It's not to come, it had already come. Well, why didn't the writer say? The writer has not put the age in which we are living in subjection to the angels. Why didn't he say that? Why did he not say God has not put this age in subjection to the angels, but in subjection to the Son? Why did he say he has not put the age about to come if that age had already come? You see, there's nothing about the grammar, there's nothing about the language, there's nothing about the linguistics that agrees with Gary Summers and his take on Hebrews 2 or Hebrews chapter 6. His view of the age to come and this age are absolutely convoluted. Now, let me illustrate that just a little bit more. In Ephesians chapter 1, 20 and 21, it speaks of Christ and how God has highly exalted him and seated him above all things, given him a name that is above all things, not only in this age, but in the age to come. Now, here's where it gets really interesting for Gary Summers and his camp. Gary Summers believes that he was referring to this age as the Christian age. And the age to come is the eternal state after the end of time. But let me remind everyone who's listening here, okay? This is really important, folks. An age is a period of time that is determined and defined by the covenant that dominates that age, by which that age is identified, that age that draws its identity from that covenant. We are in the new covenant age of Christ. We are in the Christian age. Why are we in the Christian age? Because it is the age that is identified by the new covenant of Jesus Christ. Okay. Now watch this. According to Gary Summers and the men on that platform, They do not believe, number one, there is any time after the end of time. They do not believe, as we pointed out in depth last week, but it's important to drive this point home, they do not believe there is a covenant in existence, and certainly not the gospel, after the end of time, because there's no evangelism, there's no benevolent work, there is no sin to be overcome. There is, therefore, no age to come, because there is no time and there is no covenant after the end of time. So for Gary Summers to stand up and say, well, the age to come, that's the time after the end of time, that's being totally disingenuous. That is to contradict his own definition of an age as a period of time determined by the covenant that dominates that period of time. Okay, I think that's enough on that particular thing. I want to move on, through the program. William, are you back?
Yes, I am. Let me get that question for you. Just had it up a moment ago, but I'm going to have to pull it back up. It was a question regarding the kingdom, and let's see. Here we go. It is from a gentleman who says, is it possible that Jesus' rule was strictly in his heavenly kingdom, but not on earth? Let's see. That his rule on earth came to an end, that the everlasting age or Christian age was just for the heavenly kingdom. Did you quite get that?
I believe I caught the gist of it.
Okay.
My initial reaction to that is no. Christ's rule is not restricted either to heaven or to earth. Pardon me. Ephesians chapter 1 tells us that Christ was given a name above every name, both in this age and the age to come. Now, this age is the age in which time resides, in which time marches on. So Christ was given the rule, kingdom, and the authority, pardon me, over the new covenant age, which is certainly over earth. Not only that, in Matthew chapter 28, 18 to 20, Jesus said, all authority, and the Greek word there is exousia. It is not power, the Greek word dunamis. It is exousia, meaning authority, dominion, rule, if you please. Now, it's not our key, but it is exousia, and it is authority. So here is Jesus saying that he had been given all authority, where? In heaven and on earth. And I would also point out that in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10, that Paul said that it was God's eternal purpose to bring all things together in one body, in Christ, things that are in both heaven and in earth. So insofar as the Bible is concerned, Christ's rule spanned heaven and earth. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 14. Paul said, I praise God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father over one family, both in heaven and in earth. So for Paul, Christ ruled over the one family, the one body, the one kingdom that spanned heaven and earth. When people talk about the end of Christ's earthly rule, I really believe that is a misnomer. I believe that's a mistaken concept. And it generally stems from 1 Corinthians 15:25. He must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. Here we find a reference to Christ ruling, quote, until. And so people normally, in fact, all of the speakers on the dais there at the Bellview Church of Christ Lectureship take the position that at the coming of Christ, he surrenders his throne. He surrenders his reign. He no longer sits on the throne. I completely and totally disagree with that view. In Revelation chapter 11, pardon me, which is the time of the judgment, which is the time of the resurrection, the time of the judging of the living and the dead, the time of the rewarding of the prophets, what do we find? It says the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ. And he shall rule forever and ever. So here we have, from the time of the judgment, resurrection, we do not find Christ abdicating. We find Christ ruling with the Father. This is brought out even more emphatically in Revelation 22 and verse 3, in which John says he saw both the Father and the Son on the throne of the Father. One throne, one rule, being shared by the Father and the Son. So I disagree with those who believe and who say and teach that Christ would no longer be ruling and reigning. Now, was there an interim aspect to his rule? Yes, but what was that interim rule doing? It was consolidating his rule and his reign. Psalms 110, verse 4 says, "Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies." So, pardon me, Christ would rule when he ascended up on high. He went into the far country there to receive the kingdom, Luke chapter 19. When he ascended up on high, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, and there he ruled and he reigned in the midst of his enemies. And as Psalms 110 says, "Sit at my right hand until your enemies are made your footstool." Well, what was he doing sitting at the right hand? Ruling and reigning over his kingdom. He would rule there until the time came, until the last enemy was destroyed. When would the last enemy be destroyed? At his parousia. But when the last enemy was destroyed, is what? Well, once again, it's Revelation chapter 11, when it says the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ, and he shall rule forever and ever. And there's one throne with the Father and the Son on the throne in the new creation. So to answer that question specifically, no, Christ did not abdicate his rule over earth. His rule was over heaven and earth. All things were put under his feet, all things except the Father, obviously, 1 Corinthians 15, 26, 27, 28. But all things were put under him. He ruled in the midst of his enemies. At his coming, the last enemy was put under him, and he, with the Father, would rule forever and ever, because he delivered to the Father the perfected kingdom. He delivered to the Father what the Father had given him to do. He gave the Father the perfected, matured, glorified kingdom, and he and the Father sat down to rule forever and ever. Now, William, those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you summed it up, very well in terms of there is no end to the kingdom. That's Isaiah 9, 6 and 7, Luke 1, 22 and 23. I think the fact that we have the domain of Christ in both heaven and earth. You touched on Ephesians 1 and verse 10, which basically says that in the dispensation of the fullness of time, he would gather together in one all things which are in heaven and which are on earth, even in him. So the reign of Christ involves that which has been brought together of heaven and in earth. And of course, we've talked several times about the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven to be with man. So, as you said, there was this transitional or interim reign of Christ. However, at the consummation, this is when everything has been consummated, and he enters into that eternal aspect of the reign with the Father, and that continues on without end. So I think we're pretty much the same. There is no end of the Christian age. Unlike many people believe, it has no end. It coincides with with the kingdom of God. And this was, goes back to the heavens that were going to be planted according to Isaiah 51:16, and God laying the foundations of the earth. And, of course, as we discussed a little bit on last week, tying that in to the name of God, the sun and the moon, etc., so that these things would not ever come to an end. And so his kingdom was not simply only in heaven, nor was it only on earth. It is a reuniting, because sin has been done away of heaven and earth, and therefore allowing us to have access into the very presence of God. So I would leave it at that and say, hey, I think that's a pretty good wrap that you've done.
All right. Well, to continue then on Gary Summers and some of the claims that he made, he came to the book of Revelation, William, in regard to the comings of the Lord that he posits. And he says, contrary to some who take the view that Revelation is about Jerusalem and Babylon as Jerusalem, he said, I believe and I suggest that the evidence says that Revelation is about Rome. So let me point out again, you have the men on that platform who believe that if you differ with them, you're wrong. You're a false teacher. And yet you had men on that platform. Doug Post was one of them, who stood up there and said all New Testament books were written before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The book of Revelation was written before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and the book of Revelation foretold the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, Gary Summers stands up and says, no, that's wrong. The evidence says that Revelation is about the fall of Rome. Well, guess what that means, ladies and gentlemen? What that means is, since the coming of the Lord in the book of Revelation is in judgment of Babylon, and Babylon in Revelation was Rome, that means the Lord came in 476 AD. That's the view that Gary Summers, of logical necessity, must take. And by the way, folks, what that means is, since Daniel, chapter 2 and chapter 7 specifically, lie behind and serve as the source for the book of Revelation, and its description of the beast in Revelation chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 11, chapter 10 and 11. So what you have is here, you have these old covenant prophecies of this judgment that would happen in the days of the fourth beast. Gary Summers says the fourth beast is Rome. But Daniel posits the destruction of that fourth beast at the coming of the Lord, the one like unto the Son of Man, Daniel 7:21 and following. Revelation posits the destruction of the beast and Babylon at the coming of the Lord also. So once again, since Gary Summers places Revelation, number one, written after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, written during the 90s, and number two, since it predicts the fall of Rome, then of necessity, Gary Summers does not believe that all Old Testament prophecies are fulfilled. He does not believe the Old Testament has been done away with, because, after all, if Daniel, which is part of the Old Testament, foretold the fall of Rome, and the fall of Rome wasn't until 476 AD, then since Jesus said not one jot, not one tittle of the old covenant could pass away until it was all fulfilled, that means that the law of Moses, Torah, the Tanakh, could not pass away until the fall of Rome in 476 AD. Well, down goes one of the foundational pillars, amillennialism, of Gary Summers and the men on the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship, by taking his position, as he did, on Revelation and the identity of Babylon. Gary Summers demands that the law The Old Covenant endured as valid until 476 A.D. But William, he made an absolutely remarkable comment. He said the use of language alone is not valid, and it is not sufficient to determine whether or not the book Revelation is talking about Jerusalem or Rome. He said many phrases that are used in the book of Revelation can refer, now listen folks, listen very carefully to this. Many phrases can refer to Jerusalem, to Rome, or even America. William, can you think of any of the phrases in the book of Revelation that can apply to America?
Well, absolutely not. And there are several reasons. One, I just start out very quickly with Revelation 1 that talks about things that would shortly come to pass. So the first thing that we'd have to do, and if we're going to understand, Revelation regarding Mystery Babylon and whether or not Rome is involved, is to put this into a proper historical context. So that would be the first, is that these were things that were shortly to come to pass. The time was at hand. But also, if you're looking in chapter 11 gives you some very clear historical and contextual information that helps to establish that as well, because we have in verses 1 and 2 where John is given a reed and told to measure the temple, the altar, those who worship within it, but he says, leave out the court, for it is given to the Gentiles, and it would be trodden underfoot for 40 and 2 months. Well, when you look at that terminology, of course, there's symbolism in the book of Revelation. We would take the verse 1, where he talks about the temple, the altar, and the people, to refer to the new covenant creation, the new covenant temple, etc., and the altar, just as Hebrews says, we have an altar of which they have no right to eat. But the court without would be the temple. That would be the destruction of Jerusalem that the Romans came to destroy. Now, that's a part of that context, and when you put that together with Luke 21, verses 20 through 24, then you can see where very clearly Jesus aligned it with the destruction of the temple by the Romans. It would be the time when the times of the Gentiles was fulfilled, and all of that would take place within that generation. And, of course, that didn't happen to Rome. Rome didn't tread Rome underfoot within that time frame. But the second part of that I'd like to bring in is Revelation 11 and verse 8, which is another historical and scriptural marker in terms of whether or not this is America and whether or not this is Rome or even some other modern day city. And of course, in your book, Who is This Babylon, you did just a fantastic job, and I think it's on page 52 because I just finished referencing that not too long ago where you did some work on that in talking about verse 8 that, for example, Sodom has never been used to designate any other city besides itself in the Bible, with the exception of Jerusalem. And you gave various passages, Isaiah 1 in verse 10, I think it was Jeremiah 23:16 and following, and Ezekiel 16:44 and following. That's pretty good memory for something I read out of your book a few days ago, right? But at any rate, what we have is this passage, and their dead bodies shall lie in the street of that great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Now, the first thing I want to talk about here is the great city. We do have a statement from Josephus that says that Jerusalem reigned over the rest of the nations or the surrounding countries in Palestine like the head does over the body. They acknowledge that it was the greatest city. It was the central place of worship where the temple stood, etc., had all of the history and longevity there. But here's another important point about determining that great city. This was a city that had a relationship with God in terms of being married to God through covenant. No other city could we ever claim was ever in a covenant relationship with God. That was the whole point of the covenant made with them in Sinai, that he called them to be his people, said they were to be his people above all the people that were on the earth. Well, now, if you have God telling you that they were to be his own possession above all the people on the earth, what other nation could be greater than them? What advantages did any other nation have? To them were given the covenants, the promise, the services of the temple, etc., the adoption, Romans 9, I think, verse 4, and then again, what advantage has the Jew? Much in every way, because chiefly to them were given the oracles of God. So what other nation could we ever imagine would be greater than Jerusalem? We got to be looking at from a covenant perspective here, and that's where it far supersedes. Nothing else even comes close, with the exception of the new covenant creation. But in terms of those old cities back at that time, not a single one ever came close. And of course, they don't meet the criteria of spiritually being called Sodom. They do not meet the criteria of Egypt, which in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 25, he talks about Hagar in bondage with her children. That was Mount Sinai in Arabia, which is the Jerusalem which now is. So the Bible is telling you very clearly, and many other passages that tell you that. And, of course, the one that's just completely unget-overable, where also our Lord was crucified. Now, when you put all four of those together in the historical context, the argument and the case, in my judgment, is absolutely closed that no other city could be that city other than the one where the Lord was crucified, that persecuted the saints, murdered the Lord, and persecuted the apostles, etc., and were contrary to all men, and, of course, the wrath coming upon them to the uttermost. So that would be my comments on whether or not America could be anywhere near that particular city.
I think that's a great summary of some of the problems with Gary's rather naive comment. I couldn't help but think, as I heard him say, the use of language alone is not valid or sufficient to determine whether it's Jerusalem, Rome, or America, because on that same platform, Howard Denham and Michael Hatcher ridiculed a preterist for saying it's not enough just to read the Bible. And yet here's Gary Summers standing up there saying it's not enough just to have the language. And, you know, William, I found some of his so-called arguments to discount Jerusalem as the Babylon to be a little less than forthright. He said Israel was not a, quote, great nation. Well, the very thing that you just went across, all that information that you just shared with us, completely and totally falsifies that. Anyone who would read Psalms chapter 50 about Jerusalem, the perfection of beauty set in the midst of the nations, this city of all cities, the city that God had chosen, and as you shared with us, greater than all of the nations of the earth. And Gary gets up there and says Israel was not a great nation. Well, let me make a finer point here, because we're running out of time and we do want to finish our critique of Gary's presentation. You know, Revelation doesn't actually call Babylon a great nation. It calls Babylon a great city.
That's right.
Now, even if you want to grant his use of nation, the points that you just made completely falsify his argument. But he was extrapolating and saying, he was ignoring the fact that the text says the great city, does not say the great nation. So he ignores the actual text, inserts an inappropriate word into the text, and then completely ignores the fact that, as you just said, Josephus says that Jerusalem ruled over all of the territory as a head over the body. Even the Roman historian Tacitus called Jerusalem the great city and said that citizens travel from all over the world to see that city. And I give quite a historical list, or a list of historical sources in my book, Who Is This Babylon?, of references from the 1st and 2nd century. Yes, the 2nd century of men writing in retrospect, considering the importance of Jerusalem and how incredible the city had been before it was destroyed. So for Gary Summers to get up there and rather naively say that Jerusalem was not a great city flies in the face of history. It flies in the face of historians. It flies in the face of Josephus. It flies in the face of even the Roman historians who acknowledged its greatness. I find that kind of a comment to be one of two different things. Number one, it is an agenda-driven comment that is knowingly ignorant, knowingly rejecting the facts, the historical facts. Or, number two, it is a statement that derives from genuine ignorance of Josephus, of Tacitus, of the historians of the ancient days, and how they viewed and how they talked about Jerusalem. And, you know, that kind of ignorance, William, and I'm not trying to be harsh or critical, I'm just simply pointing out that Gary Summers' comments illustrate either a purposeful, willful ignorance or just a failure to study, and that was illustrated by his comment when he said, how many shipbuilders or sailors walked around in the streets of Jerusalem? You know, it's fascinating to me, and I document this in my book, Who is This Babylon? Josephus says that Jerusalem was not a maritime city. Well, what did he mean by that? He meant by that, okay, Jerusalem doesn't sit on a seacoast. Well, so what? Everyone knows that. But, folks, go to Revelation chapter 18 and read it. Get my book on Who is This Babylon and the comments that I make there based upon history, based upon Josephus, based upon historians, directly from those ancient sources, in which they tell us that Jerusalem was almost totally dependent upon the merchants of the sea for her goods. She relied on the merchants of the sea, which, by the way, they came from Caesarea Philippi, the harbor built by Herod the Great, which was an absolutely incredible feat in ancient times. But be that as it may, Jerusalem was almost totally dependent upon imports. Jehoiakim Jeremias, who was a Messianic Christian Jew, in his book, Jerusalem in the Time of Jesus the Messiah, I think that's the proper name of the book. I can get the proper name for anyone interested so that you can read it for yourself. But Jehoiakim Jeremias documents how important Jerusalem was to sailors, to merchants who sold their goods in Jerusalem, upon how important the maritime fleets were to Jerusalem, because she was so dependent upon imports. She was dependent upon imports for the gold and for the silver, for the cedar that was used in the temple. She was dependent upon the maritime imports of the spices, even on the sacrifices that were made in the temple. Now, were a lot of the animal sacrifices brought in overland? Yes, they were. I'm not disputing that. I'm simply pointing out what the historians tell us about the importance of seagoing men and their ships to the welfare, to the very existence of life in Jerusalem. Where did they get their grain? Well, certainly some of it was grown in Israel, but not all of it, not near enough of it. Where did they get it? On the ships of the sea. Now look, folks, if you're a merchant, a sea merchant in the first century, and your livelihood is dependent upon Jerusalem and the markets there, and Jerusalem is suddenly overthrown in the siege, you think you're not standing far off wailing because of the destruction of this great city? Of course you are. And so It's really disturbing to hear men like Gary Summers get up and to make comments like this that are so ill-informed, that stem from such unfortunate ignorance. Again, it's either willful ignorance, rejecting the evidence, or it is just simply a failure to study. Now, look, folks, I want to tell you in all objectivity and all candor, for many, many years, I was completely ignorant of the importance of the city of Jerusalem when it came to maritime activity. I had no earthly clue. But when I began to study, when I began to really see what historians said, when I even saw what the Bible had to say about it, I had to change my views. You know, William, we spent almost 3 weeks with Gary Summers. I think that's probably sufficient. The truth of the fact is, Gary Summers really made a very, very poor case for a yet future physical coming of the Lord. He gave us no substantive proof. He gave us no exegetical evidence. He just got up and made an awful lot of claims, and he made an awful lot of very unfortunate, very ill-informed claims. So just like the rest of the men on the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship, guess what? He failed to prove his point, and he most assuredly failed to falsify covenant eschatology. And I see that we're out of time. I want to thank
before
everyone.
You go, I want to say this. Joshua Edwards called in. He said he had spoken with you before, and he called to let you know how much he appreciated you praying on his behalf. He said that he had some heart conditions, but he says he's now out of the woods on that, and everything is fine. So I wanted to let him know that we appreciate him taking the time to call, and that you would appreciate knowing that he called to acknowledge your prayer on his behalf.
Oh, that's wonderful. We certainly did have him in our prayers. It's wonderful to know that he's much, much improved. Thank you for calling in, Joshua. We do appreciate it, and so very glad that you're better. Well, William, we are out of time. Let me say again, we want to thank everyone for joining us for Two Guys in a Bible, a voice you can trust. We'll see you next week. Good night, and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.